Welcome to the final episode of Comic Book Corner. Unless by some miracle this video gets more than 25 hits, this series is coming to a close. The amount of research involved takes forever, and even by my standard, they don't haul in the hits. About a year ago, I remember someone saying that it was liberals like Greg Berlanti who invented the illegal immigrant background to Superman. And I remember wanting to say, what the hell are you talking about? Superman? Superman's origin is, well, why should I waste my time and energy telling you when this public domain cartoon can do it for me?
In the endless reaches of the universe, there once existed a planet known as Krypton, a planet that burned like a green star in the distant heavens. There, civilization was far advanced and had brought forth a race of supermen whose mental and physical powers were developed to the absolute peak of human perfection. But there came a day when giant quakes threatened to destroy Krypton forever. One of the planet's leading scientists, sensing the approach of doom, placed his infant son in a small rocket ship and sent it hurtling in the direction of the Earth just as Krypton exploded. The rocket ship sped through star-studded space, landing safely on Earth with its precious burden, Krypton's sole survivor. A passing motorist found the uninjured child and took it to an orphanage. As the years went by and the child grew to maturity, he found himself possessed of amazing physical powers. Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. The infant of Krypton is now the man of steel, Superman. To best be in a position to use his amazing powers in a never-ending battle for truth and justice, Superman has assumed the disguise of Clark Kent, mild-mannered reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper.
So yeah, that's been part of Superman's origin from day one. And it makes total sense. The best science fiction and fantasy, the stuff that endures, it usually draws from something in the real world and tells us something poignant about the time and the people who created it. Imagine for a second a place that's the envy of all its neighbors. It is seen as being the pinnacle of science, art, music, literature, culture, and sophistication. It creates a sense of complacency. But this place is wrecked with natural disasters as well as threats from inside and outside forces. The people there don't think anything bad could ever happen. I bet since this is a Superman video, you thought I was talking about the planet Krypton. But nope. This would be Prague from 1918 to 1938 when Action Comics was first published. Superman was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, two Jewish guys from outside of Cleveland, Ohio. Given what happened in World War I and the start of World War II, it was hard for people living in Jewish communities in major cities not to know someone is affected by disease, natural disaster, displacement by war, poor economic conditions, and other hardships. Joe Shuster didn't have to look that far at all. His family came from Kiev. They moved to Canada right before World War I broke out. So it's not a question of if addressing these issues was intentional or not. Siegel and Shuster admitted to it when they were alive. Nor is it a question of if Superman is an immigrant. The real question is, what would the US government do about it? I'm not a lawyer, but I was a file clerk at an immigration law firm long enough to know the basics. I've been reading Superman comics since 1992. I've read stories as recent as 2019, and some going as far back as 1938. I've seen more interpretations of this character than you can possibly imagine, including one whose head had turned into a giant ant. And unlike Superman's spit curl, which somehow stuck around even with this haircut, our immigration laws change. Maybe not so much anymore, but we're going to look at Superman and the immigration process. Let's start with the Golden Age Superman. In the comics, I'd be talking about the original Earth 2 Superman, along with the Superman from the original Superman radio show, the Fleischer Brothers cartoons, and even a few novels and movie serials. This Superman would have landed on Earth sometime between 1908 and 1918. In those days, immigration laws were pretty lax, especially with dealing with an infant that landed in a cornfield. In those days, authorities would concern themselves with only a few things. First, has anyone come forward to claim the child? Jor-El and Lara were blown up with the other 10 billion inhabitants of Krypton. There was no Phantom Zone on Earth 2, so the chances of there being any surviving family was negligible. At the time, anyway. 2. Has the Traveler been properly quarantined? Nope. But once those 30 to 90 days were up, they'd ask themselves the most important question. Do Jonathan and Martha, or Sarah and Eben, depending on which 1940s origin you read, have the financial means to take care of a child? Well, their farm isn't part of some big industrial farming complex, but they own a house and a pickup truck, and they aren't renting their tractor, so yeah, the kids are doing pretty well for themselves. Little Kal-El would not be a burden. As much as they weren't legally supposed to do this, they would worry about the kid's race. Was he African, Asian, Hispanic, or God forbid, Jewish? Those lax laws worked both ways. They had very little reason to keep you out, but at the same time you had very little recourse if they decided there was something they didn't like about you. In this case, Kal-El was taken in because he appears white. If Jor-El had been from Laszlo Island, you can forget it. They'd have sent Kal-El back to Krypton, regardless of the fact that the largest surviving chunk of the planet was a huge radioactive rock that was super poisonous to Kryptonians. However, Kal-El, now Clark, would have been given refugee status, which would have lasted until adoption could be finalized, at which point he'd become a citizen. If he'd been older, they would have made him take a test, but since he's an infant, that's it. As long as Clark remembered to sign up for selective service, he's all well and good. The Silver Age Superman, though, the one featured in all those classic stories on Earth 1, or almost any Superman comic published between 1952 and 1986, or the Superman from the 50s TV show, or the Silver Age Superboy, etc., arrived on Earth sometime between 1925 and 1930. Here is where things get tricky. And it all comes down to 3 founding American values: racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. A lot of Americans thought that it was bad enough that we had black people who were born here, so they were supposed to have rights and stuff. We shouldn't have to bring in more. They felt the same way about Asians, especially the Chinese and the Japanese. And things got harder for Japanese immigrants after 1941. Once Pearl Harbor happened, they could forget about it. Well, unless they defected. But even then, most of those defectors spent their life in the same place the Nisei, the second generation Japanese Americans, were. Prison. For the simple crime of being alive. They felt the same way about Hispanics. Even back then, a lot of farm labor was done by migrant workers. But heaven forbid they be allowed to have a path to citizenship. Then you'd have to pay them a living wage. And the whole point of hiring them was they were cheap. And because this was America, we grew xenophobic against other white people. Of course, in those days, Italians, Spaniards, Mediterraneans, and the Irish weren't considered white people. Just because America was fighting Nazis in World War II doesn't mean we didn't have our own issues with anti-Semitism. It's just a huge difference between some discriminatory working and housing conditions and a few insults and running a mass extermination center. So in order to gain possession of baby Kal-El, that's EL because we're dealing with Earth 1, Jonathan and Martha Kent would need a whole lot of things. On top of being able to prove everything I said before, they would need a birth certificate or certificate of baptism, fingerprinting, and at least one other proof of identity. I'm not sure if Kryptonian holographic memory crystals could be used in court, but assuming they can, well, the Kents are in luck. Jor-El, at least for the Earth 1 Superman, included everything the Kents would need in the rocket. No wonder there was only room for 2 people in that rocket. Yeah, Jor-El originally assumed Laura would want to accompany their child, but she didn't. And look at everything else he did put in there. A memory crystal with all the immigration documents. Another memory crystal with the plans for the Fortress of Solitude. A Phantom Zone projector. Another memory crystal saying, hey, be on the lookout for your pet dog. Another memory crystal saying, hey, we sent your monkey along too. He didn't mention his cousin, but yeah, she's not that important. Krypton is about 26 light years from Earth. So if a ship was going 26 times the speed of light, it would still take a year to get here. Under their native red sun, a Kryptonian isn't much different than a human being. So Kal-El would need food. Even assuming they had some sort of suspended animation technology and were taking advantage of Einsteinian time dilation, that's a lot of food. And I'm sort of getting off topic. Okay, here's where things get really fucked up. Story-wise, I love 80s and 90s Superman. To me, that's the definitive take on the character. John Byrne screwed this whole issue by having the craft land in the cold, harsh winter of 1956. Jonathan Kent served in Korea. While in the army, he made buddies who now work for the CIA. They owed him their lives. So when he called up asking for favors, even ones as criminal as forging a birth certificate, they didn't ask questions. So Clark Kent had a birth certificate. In the eyes of the US government, he was the biological child of Jonathan and Martha Kent. Everything was hunky-dory. Because they never got caught. Or at least by the time they were, things had sorted themselves out. Had it been discovered earlier, the Kents would have gone to prison. Clark would have been deported. To where? I have no fucking clue. Byrne hand washes this away. A few weeks after becoming Superman, he saves the lives of an entire city. He's invited to a private sit-down with President Ronald Reagan. He tells the president his secret identity and about the forged documents. Everything! He knows he's risking deportation and having his elderly parents put in prison. But President Reagan assures him that my views on immigration are well known, but your case is different than any I've ever heard of. I see the way you eat your jelly beans. I could order you into lockup right now and you'd go, until some disaster put people's lives in jeopardy. And once you saved them, you'd go right back to your cell, because that's what this country, this planet, has come to mean to you. After all you've done, this world owes you a debt it can never repay. Any nation would be proud to have you as a citizen, and I'll be damned if that nation isn't the United States of America. And the thing is, Reagan wouldn't have even had to do all that much. Immigrants and refugees can have their statuses fast-tracked if they are exemplary at what they do. Speaking of Superman, that's how Henry Cavill got his work permit. Or how Craig Ferguson got his citizenship so fast. So how does this relate to Superman? He can change the course of mighty rivers. If he felt like it, he could restore the Earth's polar ice caps with his breath, or he could, I don't know. He could, I know! He could gather up all the world's nuclear weapons and throw them into the sun! No, wait. Can you guys forget I brought that up? People with superpowers are rare even in the DC universe. People want to use their powers for the benefit of humankind, even more so. A lot of numbers have been thrown around over the decades. The most conservative estimate is that 1 out of 150,000 people are born with some form of metagene. Of those, only 1 in 10 decide to use them for the benefit of others. So that's 50,000 superheroes worldwide. But ones of Superman's power level are almost unheard of. With his reputation, he's most of the way there. Being buddy-buddy with POTUS just gets him those few extra steps. Well, that, and it saves Jonathan Kent from having his military service reactivated so he could be tried under the Uniformed Code of Military Justice and spend the rest of his life in Leavenworth. A lot of people told me that Clark had another route to legal citizenship in 1996. After all, he married Lois Lane, and she started dating Clark before she knew he was Superman. Hell, for a while there, she thought he was her rebound guy from the Man of Steel. While it's true an immigrant marrying a U.S. citizen can help under circumstances like these, it only works if they can prove it isn't a sham marriage, which is hard, but there is no doubt this relationship is based on love. So, it'd be pretty easy. Well, if this wasn't the DC universe. Because, of course, there's a crinkle. You see, a court case known as the United States versus the Joker, as well as a law known as the Government Metahuman Asset Protection Act, makes it clear that a superhero and their civilian identity are, at least on paper, legally distinct individuals for certain purposes. This is how Gotham City got around Batman testifying in court without revealing his true identity. It also protects Batman from having to pay to get the Batmobile's tire treads wiped off of Gotham Tower, which would really involve Batman paying Bruce Wayne, but that's a whole other legal can of worms. In this case, it creates an interesting conundrum. Clark Kent is a legal U.S. citizen. His birth certificate, his social security number, everything are under the name Clark Kent. There isn't a single document with ICE under the name Superman. There is, however, a legal name change from Kal-El to Clark. But in order to have access to that document, you have to possess above top secret clearance. Lois Lane married Clark Kent, not Superman. So if the president hadn't done what he did, well, if in the eyes of the law, Superman and Clark Kent were two legally distinct individuals, Clark Kent could stay. Superman would have to go. That's it. That's every major version of Superman. This character has endured for more than 80 years. Even if comics die as a medium, I'm sure we'll be seeing him in some form or another for decades to come. Which begs the question, what about Superman as he'll be reimagined in years to come? I want to do some speculating on that, as I try to imagine what Superman would be like on those movies, TV shows, holovids, or whatever that we see in the year 2046. That Superman would have landed on Earth in 2016. And that's where things get really interesting. For one thing, that snowstorm bullshit would be unbelievable. Even most small towns have cell phone service and everyone has cameras. Someone other than Jonathan and Martha Kent would have seen that ship go down. someone in Smallville or the surrounding counties would know. It'd be cracked and fast. An extraterrestrial, even one who looks like a white-skinned, red-blooded American, would face one of three scenarios. I'm going to list them from most likely to least likely. Scenario 1. Declare a military quarantine. The entire city of Smallville, Kansas is sterilized and destroyed. The government seizes the land under eminent domain. The locals fight it in court, but lose. There were a few stragglers, but they eventually cave. Ever hear of the Centralia disaster? Yeah, like that, only with an extraterrestrial crash site and monitoring station instead of an underground coal and gas fire. The ship and Kal-El would be hauled away to Hangar 18 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, or maybe to Area 51. In the real world, places like that only exist in the minds of science fiction writers and tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy whack jobs. But in the DC universe, they're a dime a dozen, including those real locations and a few fictional ones like Belle Reve Prison in Louisiana, or the hollowed-out mountain chain used by Project Cadmus. In most timelines since 1986, Superman didn't gain his powers until he'd been absorbing yellow sunlight for about 18 years. So the scientists would do some basic tests on him, take a few DNA samples, and then murder him to prevent further biocontamination. Scenario 2 would be take him to an immigration court. He wouldn't necessarily have the right to a representative, or any sort of parental supervision. That's right, at those refugee centers along the border, you had kids as young as 3 or 4 years old have to plead their own cases in court without an attorney. After going to court and there being no way to get him back to Krypton, he'd be held at a refugee center indefinitely, which are rampant with starvation and physical abuse, including the kind I can't talk about on YouTube. I can't see things going well for young Kal-El, or the people responsible for his abuse. Well, assuming he lived long enough to absorb the yellow sunlight he needed to get his powers. Need to know more? Go watch the movie Brightburn. Scenario 3. Somehow, some way, the court decides it would be in his best interest if he were put into the foster care system at least until someone came to claim him. Which can't happen because Krypton is toast. He might be given back to the Kents. He'd probably be given to someone else. I find it unlikely that he'd be given back to the Kents given that they knew he was an extraterrestrial and tried to conceal it. But even if he was, the Kents would be under constant surveillance. Until Clark reached the age of 18, this would be perfectly legal, just to a standard check with Child Protective Services. After that, an organization like the CIA, the NSA, the ASA, or the DEO could use extra legal means. Oh, and there is no way they are keeping the ship or any of that tech. So on the one hand, Superman never gets his Fortress of Solitude. On the other hand, he doesn't get a Phantom Zone projector which he could use to accidentally release hundreds of Kryptonian criminals. In any case, the fate of a Superman who landed on Earth in the Trump era is depressing to think about. We're talking makes Zack Snyder's Man of Steel look like an episode of Peppa Pig. I know, that's a bit of a downer to end the series on, but life is like that sometimes. The only place you'll find a really complex problem with a really simple solution is in a comic book. Maybe that's why so many of us love them. This has been the Comic Book Corner. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. And to really see this channel grow, visit patreon.com/ParityErrorFilms and become a patron.